Sir Alexander Mackenzie left a great legacy, but not necessarily one that he was aware of at the time. He envisaged the amalgamation of the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and this actually happened the year after Mackenzie died. Also, because of his transcontinental exploration, the vision of Canada as a transcontinental dominion was made possible. He also set a really inspiring standard for how one can achieve much under really difficult circumstances. He also shows us today the excitement and the challenges of the early days of living in the North American continent. Mackenzie also set a standard for how one should respect and negotiate with Indigenous people. Mackenzie influenced other explorers, there's no doubt about that, because his explorations took place in 1798 and 1793. He published the book about his explorations in 1801. Well, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, he read Mackenzie's book the year after, in 1802. It was then that Jefferson really formulated the idea that he needed to send Lewis and Clark, because Jefferson wanted to make sure that Great Britain wouldn't claim lands out west for the British Empire. Lewis and Clark also read Mackenzie's book, and they probably took a copy of it along on their journey, which happened 12 years later. So Mackenzie's book was a model for Lewis and Clark. It was a model that taught Lewis and Clark not only how to embark on exploration, but also how to write about exploration. Mackenzie's writings would have also influenced other explorers who came after him, like John Franklin or Simon Fraser. In those days, any book on exploration would be read by many members of the public and other explorers. They were also read by interested governments, map makers, business people. Everyone was interested in new territory. Mackenzie was definitely very much a leader. He showed great leadership skills for such a young man. He was only 25 when he set out on his first journey of exploration. He was only 29 when he achieved the great accomplishment of his life. He was able to organize, command, and delegate responsibility to the men who accompanied him, and he did this in a really effective manner. He was able to calm down the men when they became afraid, when they became panicky, when they wanted to turn back. He was able to encourage them to keep going. He was able to deal with First Nations in all different circumstances and to save his expedition from harm. He was able to take advice. He was able to make good decisions, not based on pride, not based on ego, but on what made the best sense. He was able to identify the areas in which he needed training. So he went and got training in exploration. And his success was therefore also due to his training and his knowledge of the technology of his time. He had a lot of charisma. He had a real sense of responsibility, and he didn't give up easily. And therefore he made good decisions. These are all excellent leadership skills. Many Canadians know about Sir Alexander Mackenzie. Canadian public school students are all taught about Mackenzie. And because they learn about him in school, most Canadians regard Sir Alexander Mackenzie as an important explorer who's famous for extending Canada's boundaries across the continent, and also kind of giving a model for what the country would look like in the future. Mackenzie actually gets widespread recognition. It's always good when historical figures get more recognition, and it's great when that recognition lasts over the years. There are many places in Canada named after Mackenzie, so the public is made aware of him in that way. The public, for instance, can hike part of the Sir Alexander Mackenzie Trail. In the 1990s, Canadian university students took part in recreating Mackenzie's expedition to the Pacific. In 1970, the Canadian government issued a stamp in Mackenzie's honor. There are many schools, high schools as well as public schools, named after Mackenzie. There are many streets named after Mackenzie. Of course, the Mackenzie River is named after him. This is the longest river in Canada, and we also have the Sir Alexander Mackenzie Provincial Park. In British Columbia, there's a national heritage site called Fort Alexandria. That's named after Mackenzie, and there's a town in BC called Mackenzie. There's even a specially developed rose called the Sir Alexander Mackenzie Rose that was first introduced in 1985. So there are many examples of how Canadians recognize Sir Alexander Mackenzie. Naturally, it's always great to see researchers doing work on him, so it would be super to have more biographies of Mackenzie available. Mackenzie's very important in Canadian history. He contributed very greatly to the early economy of Canada. He was very important in developing the fur trade in Canada, and he therefore contributed to the growth of Montreal, as well as other fur trading centers. Mackenzie's extremely detailed descriptions of his explorations, the vegetation, the climate of the various regions that he visited, the geography of the areas he explored, and the descriptions of waterways and mountains adds greatly to our knowledge of what the country looked like then. We can compare it to what it looks like today. We can see how the geography has changed, how climate change has had some effect. So his records are unbelievably valuable to people today. And then there are his excellent descriptions of First Nations. These are all people whom he encountered. And this gives researchers a very good idea of the different cultures that he met, how people looked, what they wore, the languages that they spoke, how they lived, the kinds of homes that they built and lived in, and how their economy functioned. Mackenzie's journals are therefore of great importance, not just to historians, but also to geographers, anthropologists, many other kinds of researchers. Mackenzie's writings also make available to First Nations peoples another part of their history, as well as written records about their ancestors. Alexander Mackenzie is just as important in history as Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark are important to American history, and Mackenzie is important to Canadian history. They explored different areas of North America, and they weren't in competition with each other. Although they were all aware of each other's accomplishments, of course Mackenzie heard about Lewis and Clark, and they knew very well about him, but it wasn't necessarily a competition. All of them contributed to the contemporary knowledge of unexplored territories. They all contributed to the historical record. They all left valuable primary documents for students, such as yourselves, and researchers to access well over 200 years later. So Mackenzie's explorations are what we know best about his career, and they are very important. He was the first non-First Nations person to prove that the Mackenzie River flows into the Arctic Ocean. This had not been known before. He was the first to identify the exact route of the Mackenzie River. This was really important because it immediately increased what people knew about the geography of North America at that time, and all the maps of this area had to be changed. Mackenzie was also the first non-First Nations person to reach the Pacific by land north of Mexico. This was important because it allowed Canadian fur traders to trade regularly with China, and it also gave people the idea that Canada could be a transcontinental nation. It also gave more credibility to Great Britain's claim to the northwest coast. It linked Montreal to the Pacific. That is just about coast to coast, and made Montreal the most important city in Canada for the next 150 years. His explorations also showed the possibilities of transcontinental trade. And, of course, last but not least, by encouraging President Thomas Jefferson to send Lewis and Clark on their journey, Sir Alexander Mackenzie also influenced the course of American history. There are a couple of things that I find interesting about Mackenzie and hope that scholars might research in the future. And that is his personality and what he did and thought about in his retirement. He retired at quite a young age and married a really young girl with whom he had 2 children. I'd like to know that future generations of historians will write about Mackenzie's life as a family man and how his children may have carried on his legacy. And these are a few of my thoughts about Sir Alexander Mackenzie. Thank you very much.